Good evening. Welcome to the Outhouse production. This is David. I've got Brock with me today. Wanted to give you a bit of a rundown on what the Outhouse broadcast is going to be going forward. So, Brock, let's lead with you. Just give us a quick overview of kind of what our vision will be going forward here.
Oh, sure. Yes. It's been kind of a long time in coming between you and me. You know, we've been friends for, 8 years now? Maybe longer?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it all just really started with taking breaks at work, and we would just go on those walks and have just discussions about, it would have been about work, but it would have been about the world around us, just a place where nobody's there. You're just walking in a park, just talking, And I think more than anything, between you and me, the best discussions that we had whenever we were talking about truth, or when we would get to the bottom of a certain matter,
right?
It's because truth won out the day, and I think that's really where it started. And what it's blossomed into is like, hey, why aren't we recording our conversations? And seeing the emergence of podcasting throughout these last few years, just the popularity of it, it's surpassing radio.
I think that it was a really cool phenomenon when we first met, just like you were talking about. This is actually jogging my memory, things I haven't really thought about in a long time, but those walks were important. Those conversations were important because we were both free to have open discussions about pretty much anything that we wanted to. There was no constraint. We're just willing to brainstorm and talk about important things that maybe were not the conversation topic of the day for most people, but for us they were important. And I think as time goes on, I realize there's a lot of people out there maybe interested in having open discussions about the same types of things in a safe environment where they're not going to be judged or ridiculed or, looked down upon. I want this to be an open forum for free thought, essentially. And, looking back on things, I feel like that was a very healthy thing for us to go through.
Right.
Being able to challenge normative ideas in society. For us, it was a religious thing at the time, but as we're kind of growing into our own skins as Christians, I see the same need in all of life to be able to question the official things that we're told, to be able to have a free thought experience, essentially, in a place where other like-minded people also want to have an open discussion. And so that's what we're all about, and that's what we want to bring to our listeners. Any other thoughts on that, Brock?
I think that's going to lay the foundation for and open it up to the possibilities of who we can have on this show, who we can talk to, who can engage. It pretty much opens up to everybody. Everybody's got a story, and it's when you really ask about a person like, oh, how are you? When you ask that question, it seems like in this society, it pretty much stops there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stops there, whether that be in a church environment, a school, college, whatever. Even in business relationships, you have to dig a little bit further in business relationships, but do we really know a person? And what does that mean? And I don't even know if I know myself, much less somebody I have never met before. But hopefully we can bring that to our listeners. That's my ultimate dream for this podcast, is to be able to have people on the show that actually open up and give us their story about a variety of subjects that interest us.
I think ultimately growing a community of open-minded individuals who are also interested in kind of questioning the official narrative and learning a little bit. I want to grow a community to be able to interview more and more people, get their experiences on the table. I want to kind of give everybody a little taste, a little Costco freebie here real quick about what it is specifically that we're talking about. So the Outhouse broadcast, in our open-minded brainstorming atmosphere that we want to create, here are the subjects that we want to start with. I think number one, eschatology is a really interesting subject, and I think everybody disagrees on eschatology,
right.
And there's a really common normative way generally speaking, in at least the American church.
By eschatology, we're talking about the view of end times.
The view of end times, how
it's going to play out.
How God's work throughout history escalates to the end, essentially is what eschatology is, the end of the world. Also, I want to talk about what the government does in private, things that we typically don't hear about on the mainstream news media, but that we see reports of in alternative media, and put the pieces together. 2, ancient archaeology. I want to question the official narrative of what we've been taught in high school, college, grade school, the news, about where we came from, how long we've been here, what kind of technology did we have in the beginning, what kind of other races were there in the beginning, were we the only humanoid race? You see where we're kind of going with that. I want to delve into UFO experiences, paranormal, cryptozoology, things that are off the reservation for normal academics, normal normative discussion, things that are maybe marginalized to the, outcast side of society. I'd also like to bring people on who are doing the real work on the front lines of a spiritual battle, such as the abolitionists out there who are kind of marginalized to the gutters of Christianity and outcast. I want to hear their stories. I've heard there are a lot of demonized folks that come into protest the protesters at the abortion clinics. I want to touch on that as well, to kind of show the underbelly of what's really going on at the abortion clinics, for instance. I want to go into discussions about modern dinosaur tissue, fresh tissue being found in the bones, that challenges the official narrative of the archaeological construct in that worldview. So that's just a little bit of a freebie, a little flavor enhancer for our listeners. Do you have anything else to add to that, Brock? Are there any other topics that I've missed?
I think it'd be good to kind of pull the reins a little bit, because I know some of you, in a way right now, is we're really when we're weeding out our audience. People are clicking on the button and saying, is this for me? Is this not for me? And those topics that you just shotgunned out, definitely we're going to be talking about those things. But keep in mind, there's lots of apprehension to conspiracy theories. That's kind of like a word that people tag on to scare somebody, conspiracy theory. What that's really meant, it's actually a political tactic invented by the politicians themselves in these presidential debates, is to use that very tactic. Say, just call them and label them as a conspiracy theorist, and then all thinking shuts down. And I would remind you guys, one of the things that Aristotle said had a big impact on me early on. He said, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it."
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I think this dynamic with the two of us is going to be really helpful. I'm a bit more leaning towards the fantastic. You lean more towards the conservative way of thinking, and I think we'll pull each other in different directions in a good balanced fashion to be able to present something
exactly
balanced and truthful with just kind of even keel thinking on it. So that's what we hope to bring to our audience, and I hope there's a lot of people out there that benefit from these discussions, and I know there will be, because I know there's a lot of people out there that live through things that are marginalized in society, and we want to give a voice to these folks. If anybody has had an experience that I've talked about in any of the subjects that I've run by you, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to interview you, find out a little bit more about your situation, and see what we can do.
Right. And at the end of the day, all that matters is truth. We can live for whatever we want on this earth. You can live for the kids that we have, which is a great thing to live for. You can live for your marriage. You can live for whatever lifestyle you want. But in the end, the ultimate question is, what is it worth? What was it for? And that's important to understanding, who we are in the grand scheme of things. What does that all mean? It gives us those bigger pictures.
Yeah, and I think our role is to present information to the general public, not to tell people what to think or how to think, but to merely present the information that perhaps challenges the way they think of the world, and let them make their own decision on it and see what happens.
And at the end of the day, we're about truth. That's all that matters is truth.
Absolutely.
And remember, I wanted to give this illustration real quick of Plato. Do you want me to go down this road?
Shoot, go for it.
What Plato is trying to do, and we're talking about ancient Greece here, one of the great philosophers, all philosophies are built off of Plato. One of the things that Plato is trying to answer is the question of reality, or the question of truth, in other words. What is the start game? How did everything start? And in doing so, what he tried to do is tell us that the world in which we live in, and which we're experiencing right now, empirically, that what we see, taste, smell, feel, touch, he's saying that these things are merely a shadow of what is real or what is true. And one of the remarkable things that is the human experience is that we all are experiencing a world in which we, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, is what I'm seeing true? Or is what I'm seeing actually true, conform to reality? Is what I see good? That's another question. Is it good or bad? And we have a we have a consensus of these general natural laws that say something is good and something is bad. Well, why? Why is something good? Why is something bad? That's what Plato is trying to answer in the allegory of the cave.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that allegory?
Well, the allegory it really sets itself up with people chained to a wall inside of a cave. And they see nothing except the wall that's in front of them and around them. And that's their only experience. They grew up in the cave. So all they have experienced is the people next to them and the wall in front of them.
That's a nuclear bomb getting ready to go off. 10 seconds.
So, going on behind them, there's a fire. And that fire, with people behind the fire, with, I don't know if they're marionettes or whatnot, they're just casting a shadow against the wall in front of the people chained to the cave there. So let's just say that they're elephants that they're casting the shadows on the wall of. That's not exactly what Plato said, but these men are all looking at these shadows in front of them, and they're all saying it's an elephant. But that's the only picture of an elephant that they've ever saw. But consensus agrees that it's an elephant. So as the story moves on, one of the prisoners there in the cave, he breaks free of the chains, and it was a lot of effort to do that. He had to gain the strength, constantly building the muscle every single day in order to break free those chains. Painfully, he looks back. He turns his head back, and he sees the fire and the men casting the marionettes against the wall. So what he thought was an elephant before, he looks and he sees the reality of what is the elephant, the thing in and of itself, the marionette, if you will. So in that brief little portion of the story, what Plato is trying to tell us is that's exactly how truth is. This is how truth works, the reality of everything. It took a lot of effort for this man who had experienced all these things. Like, his perception of reality had been molded and had been formed. His ideas about reality have already been sealed. But somehow he breaks free of that with a lot of effort, and he looks behind him and he sees the light for what it is, the truth. But it still goes on even further after that. He somehow makes it out of the cave, and he sees a moon, and the moon is casting its light against the plains of the earth. And this man has saw truth to a greater degree. It took a lot of effort to get there, and then just the story moves on with him seeing the sun. So the point is, I think this relates to a lot of us listening to this podcast. I hope that that's the audience that we're shooting for, is those who would be willing to strain their minds just a little bit to break free of the mold that you've been conditioned in. We have been conditioned in. This is all of us, some to a greater or lesser degree. But that's what happens with those seeking truth is, wow, it's there. You just recognize it when you see it, and you see the reality for what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good analogy to that is the Matrix. You know, do you take the blue pill and with full knowledge that you're going to wake up tomorrow believing the same thing, going through the same routines? Or when you're presented with the decision of information that contradicts what you believe and is painful to believe and accept, do you take the red pill and go down the path to do further investigation with an open mind? That's really the question, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So my goal, I don't know if we're on the same page exactly with what we want to do, but my goal is to expose the guys holding the elephant up by the little marionette strings, causing the people to believe what they want to present to them and only what they present to them. That's really my target, is to expose that as much as possible. And at the same time, I think as you expose falsity and evil, you also, at the same time, bring about truth and reality. As you remove what's false, what's true naturally shines through.
And you recognize it when you see it.
Yeah, usually you do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a. I think part of what we'll be doing is raking through the mud, raking through the muck. Part of what makes truth so hard to see. Now, let's just use the media as an example in this case. What makes it so hard to determine what's true in the media is that you'll get a little bit of truth mixed with a whole bunch of twist. They'll twist it, they'll spin it, they'll create a false narrative, but there's a little truth in there. So if you can attempt to peruse a lot of different news sources, there's a possibility you can derive certain facts from each source and try and put the pieces together. We both know we're not going to watch MSNBC and Fox News and the nightly news and get an accurate picture of the world. But if you watch all of the news media outlets and you can see the facts that each one, whether intentionally or not, gives to the public, and you put those pieces together with some critical thinking, I think you can get closer to the reality and the state of affairs that's going on behind the scenes. And so that's my aim, and I think that it's going to tie in with the Aristotle aspect of things, where folks that we've been sitting there being shown images on the television by a puppeteer for years and years and years, and maybe we're just used to that. We're all used to that. And we need to reach out with a greater amount of critical thinking as we see things come out false. They're proven false. We all saw it during this year's campaign and in election season. We saw all of the news networks exposed for the fraud and the spin that they're known for. It was exposed on national TV. There's no question about it. They all looked embarrassed. They're scattering to find excuses to cover their butts. And so I think this is the right time where the world is seeing the BS come out on national television. They're all wondering how this could have happened, where news sources all over the place all get something wrong. They're all fake news and they all lied to the American public. And people are really wondering what happened and how to avoid going back to that place in the future. Mm-hmm. The worst thought here is that we're being lied to and we do nothing about it, and it just continues. We give them the benefit of the doubt that it was a mistake and it's swept under the table, and then it continues. That's a dangerous thing. You have a mass influence of information giving you the wrong information and influencing the public.
I remember very early on, this would have been back in 2005, just got out on my own, started flipping through the channels. I was never a news watcher growing up, never. And for whatever reason, you're feeling like an adult, you want to start doing adult things. And that's kind of what I was doing, was flipping through the news channels.
Or you see mom and dad watch the nightly news every night, right?
Yeah, so that's what I was used to, man.
That's how you get educated.
So this time I actually paid attention, like, okay, what's going on? So I listened to the nightly news, watched that for about, I don't know, solid 10 minutes, I don't know. And then a commercial came on, I'm like, So I just flipped the channel and I decided to keep on with my mission, watching the news. So I'd watch another newscast, and it was the same crap.
Yeah.
It was the same stories. And in a way, I kind of knew this, but I just always thought that journalism was, I'm talking about back then. I just thought that journalism was about going out and finding the raw story that no one else has. And they're just because they have to get to that story before the competition does, before the other news channels do. And that's what you see in the movies growing up. It's all about, Lois and Clark. I know that's guy watched Superman movies. It's all about that. Clark Kent was the front line. He found the stories, and that's why the Daily Planet was so popular. And that's what I grew up with. But the reality was so much different. It was what I really saw was the same different stations, competing stations, sharing the same stories. And what other conclusion could I come to than they're not the journalists? They're just reading the story. I mean, it doesn't take talent to be a journalist, is one who finds the story themselves. And these guys that I'm watching, they're authoritative because they go to these crazy spots in Afghanistan and enduring the windstorms, and you think that they're investigating something, but the reality is they're just reading something on scene.
Yeah,
so where does that news come from?
I noticed that same phenomenon when I was a teenager. I started to kind of distrust the news at that point. I thought to myself, how are these guys all... It seems improbable to me that they're all rushing out to these news stories and getting the same exact information. That to me seems improbable. And what really buried the knife was I was listening to a Conan O'Brien broadcast about 3 years ago, and he played this clip of these different news agencies all over the United States from West Coast to East Coast. And he pulled probably a good 3 minutes of clips out where each broadcaster said the same exact thing about the same exact story. It was like they were reading it off a teleprompter. And then I realized...
And we'll put that in the link below for all who want to watch that.
Yeah. And I realized they're all getting their news from the same feeder. Somebody's feeding the news to all of these stations. So ultimately what that leads me to understand is that we have a centralized news agency in the United States. It's not local. It's all part of the same Borg collective, so to speak, where somebody at the top says, this is the news people are going to see today. They send a fax out to these distributors down here right below them, and those distributors redistribute the news to the fax machines of all of the news agencies across the United States. So you get the same stories on the national nightly news, and then when you compare the local nightly news, they're all the same, and they correspond also to the national news. You don't see a lot of local flavor, and if you do, it's homogenized. And there's something wrong with that. It just doesn't seem organic to me. At the end of the day, it's like, what is going on with that?
Yeah, and then not only, it's like we all have the same facts in front of us. We're all in the same reality here. But at the end of the day, think about this. Whenever you have evidence, or say an archaeologist digs up a clay pot, we're all about evidence, aren't we? That the clay pot evidence does not speak for itself. It doesn't tell you when it lived, or who its owner was, or how the owner felt about it, or its maker. Those don't. A pot doesn't answer those sort of questions. It's all a piece of evidence does is say it's just a broken pot. That's all it is. Now, remember, there's an interpreter of the evidence. The interpreter, whether it be right or wrong, is going to look at possibly what soil is around it, whether other artifacts are around this pot. They'll try to connect evidences together to build a story, and then you have the interpretation of the story. Is all of it right? Probably not. Is most of it right? Maybe so. But still, it's an interpretation of the evidence. Now, bring this back to our discussion at hand. Whenever it comes to media, or even in the academic fields over there, when you have professors giving you lectures, there's always an interpretation of the evidence, and that's what we have. That's what we have to be cognizant of, and tell you that, we're going to bring evidences before you guys. We are interpreters just like they are.
Here's a quick example about the clay pot situation, just to kind of give our listeners an idea of where this can go wrong. Say you find a clay pot in a dirt mound in an excavation site, and that excavation site is from a village that existed 1,500 years ago. And the common understanding of that village is that they didn't have the technology to build pottery. So the interpreter, the archaeologist whose career depends perhaps on the or not maybe his career, but his whole theoretical construct of the people group that he's examining says that they didn't have this technology to build this stuff. So he concludes,
or perhaps his funding is threatened.
Oh, that could be.
You have to find something for your funding and your grants to
Well, the funding's all a part of that paradigm he's working under. And so he's got to maintain this narrative that this culture didn't have pottery because they didn't have the technology to make it. But yet he finds a piece of pottery in the burial mound. So let's say that archaeologist is thinking in his mind, this is a conundrum. Somebody must have planted this pottery in this village that we just excavated before it was covered with dirt. Oh, so what we had an invasion of other people groups now that planted the pottery, which came from another village 200 miles away. That had to have been the answer. Mm-hmm. Ignoring the whole time the obvious truth that the culture made the pottery themselves. It's the easiest answer. Occam's razor applies.
Say that. Yeah.
And this is the exact type of paradigm issue that we're running into constantly with archaeology. And it's the same thing with politics. It's the same thing with church doctrine. It's the same thing with deeply ingrained beliefs that we have that are not necessarily true.
Yeah, just remember, I have a fascination with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamian cultures myself ever since the 6th grade. And I'm always diving, it always comes back to that for me. It's just always my default topic that I love researching. What I've found is that we have a very monolithic way of viewing history in the academics, in our public schools and our colleges. It's very narrowly defined. It's very hard to find professors willing to give you a big history view. How cultures were affected by not only the political influence, but maybe even the geology, around you, maybe even the celestial bodies. They're taking all these things into account and building a picture of why things happen. That's big history. And that's missing. When we interpret history, we might look at it just in terms of kings and dates, dates. And because the king did this, did so and so, and enacted this measure, therefore the culture reacted in this way. It's a very narrow view of history. But once you start adding the astrology element to things, very astrological and way of predicting the futures, oracles and whatnot, then that adds another dimension to our interpretation of history, why they acted. And so I hope that that's what we can do in this podcast, is bring those multi-dimensional elements, the things that we've missed throughout history, and bring them together and hopefully make sense out of it, that history does have meaning.
Yeah, we kind of have this disassociated, we kind of have an atomized view of the world where every academic discipline is divorced from other academic disciplines, and there's no glue that cohesively combines all those into a world theory of life. And it's an odd thing to behold. It's like we're like we have cultural amnesia almost when we view history. We've forgotten things, and we're trying to figure out what was previously there, but all of our academics have their own disciplines, for instance. So like, let's say you have a astronomer. He's going to have a theory of the way the Earth was formed and the universe came about, for instance. And then you're going to have an archaeologist, and he's going to have his own theory about how the world came about and this and that and the other thing. And they're both going to disagree with each other, but they're going to both say that they agree. But when you really look at it, which one do you believe? Which theory of evolution, for instance? Should I believe the astronomer's theory of evolution, which says it's this many years old? Should I look at the archaeologist's theory of evolution, which says it's this many years old? Should I look at the biologist's theory of evolution, which says it's this many years old? Should I take the historian's view of evolution, which says it's this many years old? Should I take whoever's opinion? They all disagree because they're not integrated. They don't look at things holistically. And
they've become too compartmentalized, and that's how education is taught. They don't want to meld them together. Like, how does art relate to history?
That's a good.
How does history relate to philosophy? How does that relate to mathematics? And all these things, like, they're interwoven, but there's no connection point in academia today. And it's sad.
We're just kind of cut off. All of our different compartmentalized academic ventures are cut off from each other, and They all kind of have their own little world, their little islands that they're building.
It's almost like we're widgets in a machine, you know. It's like, oh, just learn your specialty, you know. As long as you're 100%, and the meaning of life is just to be wealthy, wise, and die with the most toys. You know, that's the American dream, you know. And we don't. we're so concerned about just our niche of reality that we don't want to see the big picture. And it's sad we've lost that. Where we're coming from, where are we going? Yeah, and let's just focus in on a specific subject, about history here. A few months ago, I stumbled across the books of Enoch, and you know, you've heard of them, David, because we've just been fascinated for the last few months over this subject. Mm-hmm. And I've heard about the book of Enoch, and never really gave it a second thought. Just okay, it's just apocryphal literature, okay. And then I started actually reading it, and when that happened, it was like, wow, there was a lot of subjects in the Bible that we were reading that intertwined just perfectly with the book of Enoch. And I just thought that was interesting. It had a messianic flavor to the book too. But then I go to the Bible, and I see that James quotes from Enoch in the book of James. No, Jude. I'm sorry, Jude. Was it Jude or James? No,
I think it's Jude.
I think it's Jude. Yeah. He quotes right out of the book of Enoch, and it can be argued that Jesus spoke about the book of Enoch when he's talking to the Sadducees. Remember that verse in scripture where the Sadducees were trying to press Jesus about, okay, well, there's this woman who was married to her first husband, and he died and left no children, all the way to the seventh husband. He died with no children. In the afterlife, whose will she be? And Jesus says, you neither know the scriptures, or what else did he say? You neither know the scriptures or...
I can't remember the specific quotation right now, to be honest with you. We can look it up.
Yeah, let's look it up real quick. It's right here in Matthew 22, 28 and 29 and 30 even. It says, in the resurrection then, whose wife will she be of the seven? For all of them were married to her. Jesus replied, you are mistaken because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. For in the resurrection people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. Instead, they'll be like the angels in heaven. So this is where it's argued. Now, I don't know, but this is where it's argued that Jesus is referring here to the book of Enoch when it's talking about the angels being neither given in marriage. That's not quoted anywhere in Scripture, but those elements are found within the book of Enoch. So take that with a grain of salt. But I'm not saying here Enoch is canon or anything, and that's a whole different discussion. But what I am saying is that there's a bigger picture of even Jewish history than just really what we're brought up to learn in church. You know, the churches don't talk about these things that perhaps formed, and that I'm not even going to say perhaps, things that did form the Old and the New Testament, literature that did have an influence on these writers. And what do you take away from that? How do you interpret that? And I think that's going to be a good discussion that we should have next week, is on the book of Enoch and its view of history and how it complements Scripture, perhaps, and how that matches up with physical evidences around the world.
And I think this is an issue of uneven weights and measures in our judgment. When we're talking about Enoch, if we simply dismiss everything it says because it's not canonical, we assume that it is suspect and dangerous in some way. But when I look at the way that we handle the ordinary literature, if I were to pull a history book out of my basement shelf and hand that to a modern Christian and say, will you please read this and get a little bit of a knowledge of history? They'd probably go, oh, sure, I'll read that. That's fine. And if I ask them, oh, is that infallible? And they'll go, well, no, it's just a history book. Oh, but it's suspect because it's not infallible like the canon, right? No, because we read things all the time that aren't canonize and we trust them. I read blog articles, I read history articles, I read geography articles, I watch things on TV all the time, and we don't have this like guarded sense of distrust about all of this literature that we read and watch. But when it comes to like ancient literature, if it's not canonical and it's not absolutely infallible, for some reason in the mind of a modern human being in the church, we go, oh, that is dangerous to read. Mm-hmm. If it's not infallible, it's dangerous, and we don't need to touch on it.
And that's a unique phenomenon too, because let me just take a short view of history. Here you have Martin Luther 500 years ago. He's the one of the main reformers of the Christian church, or of the Catholic Church, I should say. And you see all Christians praising him. It's the 500th anniversary this year, October 31st, of the nailing of the declarations to the church wall. But Martin Luther, even him, he was an edgy guy. But one of the things he said, he did not like the book of James. He did not like it. In fact, he didn't even think it should be in Scripture. Were people casting stones at him like a heretic? No, it was debated within the academic circles. And that's a very recent example. You look at the early church fathers, many of them had an opinion on Enoch. And we don't have, it's scary to bring it up today, but you don't see that view of Christian history anyway. You don't see this radical naturalistic skepticism that we do today.
We definitely have delved into fully into the lake of rationalism, where everything has to be neatly packaged in a logical syllogism, and it's just this paradigm that we're working out of that seems to be flavored with anti-Christian thinking from the past, from the Enlightenment period.
Yeah, and then you look at even debates within Christian circles. The reason you don't hear conversations about church history, and more specifically, how the canons came together, that's a hot topic. People don't like to talk about that because they're trying to rationalize everything. They're trying to find a nice example throughout history why this book came in this order. Like, we don't want to think about that. So it's, at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, can't we just say that God put it together through the Holy Spirit? If you're a Christian, you already live on spiritual assumptions. Why do you have to have a rationalistic explanation for everything when the very Bible that you read is not completely logical?
And I'd like to clarify, when we're saying rational, we're not saying that being rational is a bad thing.
Right.
We're talking about rationalism, where essentially it's an anti-supernaturalist paradigm that we work under.
Right, exactly.
Where we reject everything that fits outside our paradigm.
Trying to explain everything through the natural world.
Like I said, it has to have this tight, logical syllogism attached to it that can describe everything perfectly and be a real squeaky clean doctrine of the canon, for instance. Mm-hmm. If there's anything that fits outside that comfortable paradigm, anathema.
Yeah. Like, for example, when I say everything has to be logical, we're very logical creatures, sure. But you take Jesus' miracles, for example. You had a president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who took out the miracles in his Bible. He wanted to believe only the rational, the things that he could explain within a naturalistic worldview. And the Bible doesn't offer that. It's supernatural in places. The entire basis of it is supernatural. So I'm not going to cater to a naturalist when trying to explain my worldview and say that things have to be explained through a certain lens. I agree with the supernatural reality that exists, just like with Plato in the cave.
And we're still finding out about that supernatural reality. Mm-hmm. That is something that I think happens to a person over the course of their life. They're born into what seems like a normal, natural terrarium, I guess, that we're put into. And anything that comes out, we experience and learn certain things that we experience and learn things that we are comfortable with. And anything that comes outside of that, from outside that little box that we live in, we reject it, and we're afraid of it for whatever reason. It's not even something we're willing to entertain. This just goes back to that quote you pulled from Aristotle, that the educated mind is capable of entertaining thoughts without necessarily accepting them. I think that's a healthy place to be ultimately.
Right. Yeah, so that'll just bring us for our next week's discussion on Enoch, and let's take a look at what Enoch has to say. What are the implications of the book of Enoch throughout history? What happened? How does that complement Genesis, and what does that mean for the future?
Yeah, I get the gut feeling that we're missing a whole lot of valid information about our history of this planet, about our religion, about the human race, about technology, even about the gospel potentially. I think there's common themes that spread through all of that, and so we're going to go ahead and start discussing this and investigating the book of Enoch in our next podcast. So please come back and join us, and hopefully we'll all learn something really helpful. Have a great day. Peace out.